2 Samuel chapter 18, if you want to make your way there, that'd be great. 2 Samuel 18. Well, after a long feud between the Earp family and the Cowboys in Tombstone, Arizona, things came to a head on October 26th of 1881, nearing 142 years ago. Strangely enough, it was actually on a Wednesday afternoon that it took place. I would say the gunfight at the OK Corral, but that's misnamed. It didn't happen in the OK Corral, nor was it just immediately outside. It was actually 6 doors down and a back door, but it was 6 doors down from the OK Corral, and the two groups finally duked it out. And that wouldn't be the end of all the feuding that would go on between them, but it was a climactic event. And from that point forward, it was pretty much understood that the feud was going to be over, even though, again, there were some more things that happened down the road. I say that because you might look at our Wednesday night as the showdown at the biblical OK Corral, or at least 6 doors down from it. But ours is going to take place in the mountains of Ephraim. And we also have two groups. Who are these two groups that are going to be dueling? Who's the leader of one group? David. And who's the leader of the other group? Absalom. And what's the connection between these two guys? Father and son. That would be probably the most difficult, I'm sure, of any battle that would need to take place. But that's what's happened here with things, and we're in chapter 18 this evening, 2 Samuel 18, as you're already at that spot. The first verse, and David numbered the people who were with him, and he set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. By the way, where is David right now? Does anybody recall? Who's been a part of the study? In what town do David and his peeps find themselves? I'm going to show you the map that we've looked at for a few weeks now, and I'll give you a hint. It's across the Jordan River. It's about latitude-wise in the middle of the Promised Land, but outside of the Promised Land on the east side. Is there a town over there that stands out to you? Not Gilgal, no, but that's an important one, and big things happen. Excuse me, will you say that again, please? Okay. All right. This is probably wrong, but I say Mahanaim. I'm sure that's wrong. I mean, it'd be difficult to pronounce and to be able to, really stick it. But Mahanaim, or whatever you said, or whatever somebody else, your guess is as good as mine. But yeah, it's on the east side, again, on a latitude about right in the middle of the Promised Land, but it's in the land of Gilead. Once more, I will say on the east side of the Jordan River. All right, now, if you'll recall, David has people with him going back to chapter 17 and verse 24. It's mentioned David went to Mahanaim. He sets up shop in that place. And Absalom, his son, is hot on the trail. He also crossed over the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. But as we start in chapter 18 tonight, we find that the numbering of the people takes place with David being still true commander-in-chief, and he sets captains of thousands, captains of hundreds over them. And it gives us an idea that David has a lot of men, even though we don't have an exact number. He has at least in the thousands of men who are ready to go do battle. Verse 2, then David sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab. As a reminder, who's Joab? Good. He's the commander of the armed forces of Israel. Okay? So you have David sending out his commander over the main army, but just over 1/3 soldiers in this case. 1/3 under the hand, at the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, and thankfully we're reminded here that's Joab's brother. Lots of experience with his leadership team together. And 1/3 as well under the hand of Ittai, the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I also will surely go out with you myself. But the people answered, you shall not go out. For if we flee away, they will not care about us, nor if half of us die, will they care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us now. And even though we don't have an exact number, I kind of wonder if that might be the total number of what the army might be. And they might be saying, hey, if all of us are lost, that's no big deal if we save you. That's the main thing. But if we lose you and save all of us, maybe as many as 10,000, could be more than that, then we've lost everything. We don't want to lose you. They say, for you are now more help to us in the city. Let's not forget the experience that David has in war. I mean, he's done anything and everything in battle. Why do you think it is that the people say here, we don't want you to go out with us? And I know there's the mentioning of how important you are. Well, was he not important when he used to go out and fight all the battles? And nobody really had any qualms with it back then. Do you recall the history of what's taken place? If you will, turn back to chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel 11. And, of course, this is just preceding what happens with Bathsheba and Uriah, all that stuff. But 2 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 1, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, it's normal for kings to do that. David sent Joab, his prized commander, and his servants, the soldiers with him, and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites, and they besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. Why is he not going out to fight with the troops? It could be that he just has things on his mind that he shouldn't, and it may be that he's already has some background, is chasing after this woman or maybe other women. I don't know that that's really what it is. Turn later on into chapter 21 of Samuel, 2 Samuel 21, and we're going to read verses 15 through 17, but I do want to point out this important fact. As you're turning to 2 Samuel 21, I want to mention from chapter 3 of this same book, you have recorded the last words of David. But then you go into chapter 24, which is the last of the account, and you have a number of acts within David's kingship. Like a lot of the Old Testament, 2 Samuel isn't perfectly written in chronological order. There are some snippets that are out of place, and I'm not calling that a mistake. Don't take that the wrong way. They weren't intended to be written, all of it, in chronological order. So just because we find this later on in the book in 2 Samuel 21 does not mean that this is like some of the last things that happens in David's life. 2 Samuel 21, 15 through 17. There was war again between the Philistines and Israel, and David went down together with his servants, and they fought against the Philistines. And David grew weary. And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze, and who was armed with a new sword. You give a grown man with the heart of a boy a brand new toy, and he wants to play with it. And he thought to kill of all people the king of earthly, understood kings, David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, one of those trusted allies, quickly came to his aid and attacked the Philistine and killed him. But the men of David swore to him, you shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel. I believe David's at a point in his life that he's become more of a liability on the battlefield than he has an asset. Does anybody remember what James Smith, a really good Old Testament commentator, excellent in Hebrews, not a church member, he was a member of the conservative Christian church, but James Smith in his commentary, he mentions that it's believed from tracing all the history and the genealogies and all that kind of stuff that we're given, David's age to be what with his blunder involving Bathsheba, and he believes it's actually down to the exact year that it can be pinpointed. Does anybody remember that? David's not a whippersnapper when that occurs. Yeah, very good. Nice, Adam. About 60 years old. Now, the exact number he puts on at 58. So, yeah, about 60, he would say. And then we know with everything that involves Absalom and the killing of Amnon and the fleeing and then the coming back home, there's a passage, around 5 years. So if that's the case, by the time we get into 2 Samuel 18, David's going to be between 60 and 65 years old, which is really funny, maybe not from his perspective, but we talked about this in our 1 Timothy Bible classes on Sunday, 60 to 65, right? Tony was mad at me after, 60 to 65. What do Americans, and people all around the world, what do we tend to do? We start looking at that, especially in developed countries, as what kind of age? That's retirement age, because the body isn't all the same as it used to be by that point. And so, not Daniel, David isn't physically everything he used to be. And he says, hey, this is a big deal. He's right about that. This is a huge deal. I'm going to go back to the old days, you know. And as it would be said, I'm not as good, or I'm as good once as I ever was, even though, you know what I'm trying to say. But he's not the same as he used to be all the time. One more hurrah, I'll go out there with you. And the guys say, no. We remember what happened. There was a time when you fell. It may even be that he passed out and he fainted on the battlefield and you were about to be slain, and we had to swoop in and save your life. We're not letting that happen again. And if you look back at what the people say, I think it makes a lot of sense in verse 3. You are now, or these days, more help to us in the city than what you are on the battlefield. You see, he's a liability when he goes out. He's no longer an asset. So the king says to them in verse 4, all right, fine, it was worth a try. Get back out there just one more time. He says, whatever seems best to you, then that's what I'll do. I'm your king. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out before him by hundreds and by thousands. Now the king had commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, his 3 captains, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. Let's not forget who Absalom is in the kingdom. We know what he is relative to David. But who is Absalom in the kingdom? In Israel. What has he recently done? Okay, so he's the technical king, really, at this point. Now we understand he's a pseudo-king. He's a fraud. He is guilty of treason. He's a traitor. You can't trust him for anything. He's won over the hearts of the men of Israel. He's now actively trying to murder his own father. A very good dad. Well, very good person anyway. I don't know if he's been a great dad, but all things said and done, he's had plenty of mistakes, and recently, there's no doubt about that. But a good guy and a righteous king, and he's trying to murder him so he can steal his throne. Now, let's look at this from the standpoint of the king to his soldiers, especially his captains. He's sending them out to try to preserve his life and the kingship, but he says, whatever you do, just be really easy on the traitor. Don't hurt the liar and the murderer. That's got to be hard for them to hear. And in fairness to David, this has to be a difficult act to balance. When on the one side, yes, he's all those things, but the fact's never going to change that it's also his son, and he wants good things for his boy. But that's what he tells them, and all the people heard when the king gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom, and that's probably a good thing. We're going to find out later. So the people went out into the field of battle against Israel, and the battle was in the woods of Ephraim. Remember, this is our 6 doors down from the OK Corral tonight. This is where the showdown is going to occur. So the battle's in the woods of Ephraim, and I hope it shows. I think it does probably well enough. So if you'll notice, really close to Mahanaim, and that's where David has fled from Jerusalem. He's gone up to Mahanaim, and he set up his camp in this place, and we're told that Absalom is hot on his heels, so he's also following from Jerusalem, and he comes up to this area, and the battle's going to happen right here. Notice it's on the east side of the Jordan River Valley in the forest of Ephraim, so not very far at all from where David's been staying this short time. Verse 7, the people of Israel were overthrown there, and by this it's meant the bad people, the ones who jumped ship and followed after the pseudo-king. They were overthrown there before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. One day setting, 20,000 people in such a tiny area, a small area overall anyway, where people live, no small number for sure. Verse 8, for the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside. And this is interesting to me. The woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. I don't believe this is probably a full-on Chronicles of Narnia style battle. Remember, isn't that the one where the trees start fighting back, or is that Harry Potter? I don't think the trees like come to life and start, shoots, roots are coming up out of the ground like that. But I think it's saying that the terrain is so rough. As people were riding through, they probably by limbs got knocked off of horses, and it wouldn't be a safe place probably even to ride your animals through here, much less try to be doing battle. But why do you think that David and his men would seem to thrive in this environment compared to Absalom and his men? First of all, Absalom has how much experience as CEO? He's not been in an executive role before. Well, no, not really a fully one. Maybe somewhat of an ambassador at a point, but yeah, nothing very significant. He's not battle tested. He hasn't been through that. His men, probably the younger and lesser experienced. Now, you compare that to David, roughly 65-year-old David. What's he been through in life so far? Remember at around 17 years old, give or take, doing battle with Goliath on the field, and just immediately goes into, and he becomes captain over a 1,000. And then he is in survival mode in the wilderness, running for his life, and with his men, he becomes king, and he fights for decades. I mean, this guy, he's fought wars and all over these countrysides his entire life. His men are seasoned vets, and some of the advice that was given to Absalom, and I believe this is true, do not underestimate these guys. They may have some age on them, but they also have experience. In athletics, you'll see some really talented teams that do really well at certain points, but whenever the limelight, they're right in it, and whenever the lights are shining most brightly, and it's in the biggest moments, those with great talent but less experience seem to fade, and those that are battle-tested seem to thrive. And that's what occurs right here. They know this countryside. I don't think Absalom and his men know it nearly as well. The woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. They would have been knocked off by limbs, and they were running into trees probably. There are pits into which they and their animals were falling, and then they were being slain. Verse 9, then Absalom met the servants of David. This is what we've been waiting for right here. Here's the Earp family versus the cowboys. Absalom met the servants of David. Absalom rode on a mule. The mule went under the thick boughs of the terebinth tree, and his head caught in the terebinth. Now, by his head caught in it, what do you think we're finding here? What probably caught in it? Okay, attached to his head and his hair. Go back to chapter 14, if you will. 2 Samuel 14, and let's look at verses 25 and 26. It's amazing the way God works and the way He looks at things compared to the way human beings look at things. Verses 25 and 26 of 2 Samuel 14. Now in all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, wasn't very often, for at the end of every year he used to cut it once a year. When it was heavy on him, it's too much, and I'm using too much shampoo and conditioner. Got to get a break. It's getting too hot. It was weighed 200 shekels by the king's weight. Does anybody recall, or do you have in your Bible version the weight of that? How much weight just from the hair of his head? And it's funny, all the emphasis the Bible could put, maybe where the real impressive feature of Absalom is, if anything, it's the guy's hair. You haven't seen anything like this hair, huh? Yeah, his hair. 5 pounds. 5 pounds. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. Do you think it's possible that any of the men of Israel might have looked at Absalom from time to time and said, man, that guy, he's got it all. Be like him, and look at his muscles and his facial features and all that hair, something about that. How many people do you think wish they could be like Absalom in physical appearance, what he was? And what a beautiful scene that God knows from the very beginning what's going to be the downfall of that man. It's going to be his handsome appearance and But mainly, that primary feature is going to be that hair. It's going to be his downfall. How many times do we look at ourselves and whatever it is, and physically we're upset about something about our appearance, and we wish we could change it? I'd be careful about that. Keep your spot here. I really want to bring this out, and we'll move on. Turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians 12. We're going to read verses 7 through 10. This is as Paul's writing, defending his apostleship to this group of folks. And he mentions this in verse 7. He says, "So to keep me from being too elated by the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being too elated." Now, if you read from the letter to the Galatians, it's obvious there's something going on with his eyes. And most people believe not only for it to be an impairment for his vision, but also that it was awful, grotesque, to look upon the man as he stood before congregations and taught them. And undoubtedly, he was embarrassed by that. His eyes would probably water and mat over, and it was just hard to even look at the man as he spoke. Again, that's what a lot of commentators will say about what his likely condition was. But we do know from Galatians it's something involving his eyes. And he says, "So this was given to me, harassed me." And he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Therefore, Paul concludes, "I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Paul wanted to be more normal, like everybody else. He wanted this feature of his body that was both a headache and probably also just a source of embarrassment to him. He wanted it gone. And God says, "No, you don't understand. You need this. This is actually going to help you spiritually." One other I want to look at before we move on. Turn to Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 and the foretelling of the Great One, our Savior, the Messiah. First 3 verses, Isaiah 53. "Who has believed what they heard from us? They weren't convinced. And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" Trying to explain to them the importance of Jesus, who he is from the beginning, what he can do for people now, as this prophecy 750 years later will be fulfilled. "For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground," almost like malnourished, a root out of dry ground. "He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. And as a consequence, he was rejected and despised by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not." I think from what we're told in Scripture, God intentionally made his Son to not be the most captivating of all human beings. And I think it was for a very important purpose, so people wouldn't put their trust in the physical side of things. But if you have your trust in this guy, it couldn't be because of anything you see on the outside. Not that impressive, but because of what you know exists on him from the inside. Yes, ma'am. Go right ahead. Yeah, he does. One of the best ones, by the way, I've seen, just as a depiction of that, is the Killing Jesus movie that was made. Yeah, if you look at that one, it's a little different, the depiction of him. Yeah, I think. But I'm with you, especially in the Bible and the Son of God movie. Right. Because we want to see something physical. Yeah, we want to trust in what we can see, not in what we can't. Right. Yeah, you're right. But I just thought that was interesting as I was going through this, that, the Bible really emphasizes, man, this guy, people just love to look at him, and especially the main feature, God created to be his downfall and to bring about his death. Isn't that crazy? Awesome stuff. But I think it's a good lesson for us, too, that when we're, about ourselves, others, whatever, nitpicking, to realize God has made each of us the way we are, physically speaking, for a reason. And glory be to him for it. All right, so the mule went under, we're back in chapter 18, sorry, verse 9. "The mule went under the thick boughs of a terebinth tree." All right, I looked this up, and I don't know if you ever looked at a terebinth tree before, but here's one. They don't really reach that high. They kind of remind me a little bit of a crabapple tree, how they really branch out, and they're not a really large tree, but maybe a little bit different. Notice those low-hanging branches, and to me they almost look like some of those root wads that you'll see. I mean, much thinner, of course, but those root wads that you'll see when you're floating on the Ozark streams. It's just really, bushy and gnarly. In the streams, there might be a big cottonmouth curled up in one of those. Probably not over here, but no, you can see though they don't go that high off the ground. And man, if you were trying at a high speed to go underneath there, it'd be easy to get caught up, especially if you got 5 pounds of hair on your head, just bouncing along. Use extra volumizer the night before, and so all right. So he got his head caught in the terebinth tree, so he was left hanging between heaven and earth. And I think God wants it that way, so maybe he can hang there and he can think a little while about what he's doing. He doesn't immediately die. It's just that his head's caught in the tree. And the mule which was under him just keeps on going. He's just hanging in that tree, and there's nothing that he can do about it. Now a certain man saw it and told Joab, one of the 3 captains in this conflict, and said, "I just saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree." So Joab said to the man who told him, "You just saw him, and why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt." But the man said to Joab, "Though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son." In other words, you can't buy my allegiance. He's a very different kind of guy, apparently, than what Joab is. Not always the most upright in character, the commander of David's army. "You could have given me 1,000 silvers a shekel, and I would not disobey my king. For in our hearing the king commanded you, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, 'Beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise I would have dealt falsely against my own life,'" meaning the king would have killed me in return because I disobeyed his orders. I know better than that. "For there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. You wouldn't have stuck by me. I know you and your character." Ouch. Not exactly a praise of this man. Then Joab said, "I cannot linger with you." And he took 3 spears in his hand himself and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. Well, that's not very respectful of this man to do, is it? What do we know about Joab's past and his uprightness, and especially as it might involve the respect and the obedience toward his king, David? What did he do with Abner once David signs off in an alliance and he's bringing all of Israel together? He was, the old general over the army under Saul's and then under Ishbosheth when there's the conflict and the brief civil war. What does he do involving Abner back in chapter 3? In a time of peace, he calls him over and says, "Hey, listen, come over here. I got to talk to you about something." Whoosh! Stabs him right in the stomach, murders him there on the spot. And David, the king, curses him for his actions, yet he keeps him in charge of his army. The point being, he hasn't always been respectful to the king's orders, to the king's wishes, hasn't always been the most moral of people. In fact, he apparently, according to this guy's testimony, he lies through his own teeth. He knows he wouldn't have stood up for him and tried to protect his life, and he says, "You know better than that also." So he strikes him against the king's orders while he's still alive. He could have taken him, which is what the king wanted, into custody, while he's still hanging in the midst of the terebinth tree. And 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. They finish him off. So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the people. Now, I do think this is probably a credit to him. Why do you think this might be advantageous moving forward? What's the attempt here? It's not revenge. It's not, "Oh, you wanted to jump sides, huh?" That's what it's all about. It reminds me so much about our own civil conflict and in our nation and the Civil War. I've told you before, but to me, one of the most touching things of the entire operation, regardless of on which side you stand, is when President Lincoln sat at Confederate President Davis's desk whenever they had already taken over, and everything's done. And he's sitting there wondering just, what do we do next after the 4 years of upheaval that we've had? And he said a feeling as he sat on his desk came over him, and he really empathized with the Confederate president. He sat there and he thought, and he said, I knew at that point what needed to happen. He said, forgiveness. We needed to bring the people, the nation, back together. And that's what you have right here. Again, that's a credit to Joab. I mean, he could have gone after and pursued all these, hey, we're going to pay you back. And instead it's, hey, guys, let's stop. Let's stop this. The guy who's behind all this, he's gone. That's only going to hurt the cause. And the healing process very soon then can begin. Verse 17, and they took Absalom and cast him into a large pit in the woods and laid a very large heap of stones over him. Doesn't sound like a very respectful burial, does it? Whew, there's a hole. And then they just pile it up with stones. Don't even bother. Doesn't sound like with dirt. Then all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. What a rough time in Israel's history. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up a pillar for himself. You think he might have known that he's pretty good looking and had some success in early days? He set up a monument already to commemorate himself, which is in the King's Valley. For he said, I don't have any son to keep my name in remembrance. Perhaps he recognizes I might not survive this attempt to overthrow the nation. And so he sets up this pillar, this monument to honor himself for down the road. He called the pillar after his own name. You know how humble Absalom is by this point. And to this day, it is still called Absalom's monument, of course, understood at the time of writing. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, who's that guy? I know we've had a lot of these that we've gone back and forth for chapters. Priest. Okay, yeah, this is the priestly family here. And Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, let me now run and take news to the king, how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies. And Joab said to him, you shall not take news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to the Cushite, which is another word for Ethiopian. This is a person of darker colored skin than the Israelites. They're more of the medium brownish. This would be a very dark-skinned individual from Ethiopia. And he says to him, you go and tell the king what you have seen. So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. Does anyone else think that sounds kind of just different or confusing? He's like, no, this guy, I want to take the news to the king today. He was a help to communicate whenever the overthrow was going on, and he pretended allegiance to Absalom, but he remained true, loyal to the actual king, David. And he says, no, you're not going to take any news because the king's son's dead. And then he says, this guy, okay, go tell him the news. You don't have any news today. Okay, you have news. Go tell him the news. Well, what sense exactly does that make? If you look later on in verse 27, I think it helps to skip ahead just a little bit. He's going to end up going, and Ahimaaz, and the king will say, he is a good man, and he comes with good news, even though he hasn't talked to him yet. He's used to, whenever he gets news from this runner, Ahimaaz, that is good news that's brought. And what Joab is saying is, as how the king will look at it, this isn't good news. His son's dead, so you don't go. He'll get the wrong impression, and then he may be mad at you if that happens. And I think that's what Joab has in mind. So he tells the guy who's not as close to him and to the brothers in relation, the Cushite, the Ethiopian, he says, hey, you go tell the king what this news is, and that way, we're all out of harm's way. Verse 22, and Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, but whatever happens, see, I think there's some concern for this guy's life, because the king has given strict orders, do not harm my son if there's any way possible. And there's his son hanging in a tree, and at that point in that state, he's not a threat to anyone, and they just kill him. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong, it's war, okay? But according to the order of the king, it's not what he wanted, and you probably wouldn't want to be the runner to bring that news to the king. But Ahimaaz says, I'm willing to do that. I'll put my life on the line. Whatever happens, I want to be the one. Please let me also run after the Cushite. So Joab said, why will you run, my son, since you have no news ready? Verse 23, but whatever happens, he said, let me run. So Joab responds to him, all right, you got your heart set on running, you go run. And so Ahimaaz, we're told, ran by the way of the plain. Okay, so going back to our map, where does this battle occur as far as topography goes, the landscape? Okay, yeah, in the mountains and also a dense forest, right? And so this guy is probably taking the quickest route back to Mahanaim, where David is found, and running distance-wise, the shortest distance, I ought to say. But Ahimaaz, he's very familiar with the terrain, and instead of running through the dense forest, instead he goes around in the plain where it's more open. He adds distance to his journey, but because it's so open and clear, it's a faster route. Yeah, we do that a lot of times with the interstates. Well, and it pains me. It's 40 more miles. Yeah, but it's 30 minutes quicker. Oh, okay. Yeah, I hate to go extra, but that's what he's doing so he can get there a little bit faster. And that's exactly what happened. He outran then. He got there quicker than the Cushite. Now, David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof, over the gate, to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. Then the watchman cried out and told the king. And the king said, hey, if he's alone, then that means there's news in his mouth. And he came rapidly and he drew near. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, well, there's another man. I don't know how common this is, but there's another man running alone. And the king said, well, that can only mean that he also is bringing news. So the watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. I wish I could tell you whether this is an insult or a compliment. I don't know, but we're all distinctive in the way that we move, if you ever noticed. And you often can tell by the movements, even with someone from afar that you're accustomed to seeing, who that person is. He can tell by the style of running, this is Ahimaaz. And the king said, as we read earlier, oh, this is really positive. He's a good man. And that must mean that he's coming with good news, as he usually does. So Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, all is well. Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. Immediately the king cuts to the chase. The only thing that's on his mind, he said, is the young man Absalom safe? Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant and me your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about. What does Ahimaaz seem to be doing here? Deflecting, stalling, makes a lot of sense. Well, king, let me start from the beginning. All right? There's only one thing that the king wants to know. Is my son okay? And the king said, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and he stood still. Just then the Cushite came. And the Cushite said, there is good news, my lord the king. For the Lord has avenged the day of all those who rose against you. So notice the king who said to the Cushite, only thing that's on his mind is the young man, Absalom, safe. Father looking out for his child, no matter what it is that the child's done. He just wants his boy back safe and sound. So the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. Suggesting what? He's gone. And he says it's only right if everyone who does as he did would be removed from the earth also. We'd like to say our memory verse in the reflections of a father on his fallen son. Please, I don't want to do this one. It's kind of hard. Okay, I'll do this one. So 2 Samuel 18:33. Then the king was deeply moved. The king was deeply moved. And he went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, O my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, if only I had died in your place. O Absalom, my son, my son. It's interesting that all of Israel is looking at this, the traitor, the liar, the thief, he's gone, you know. And all that David can think is about his son. I don't have my son any longer. You know, there are a couple of ways of looking at this, and one, and it's going to be an argument that's made next week in our study in chapter 19. Maybe David should have been more excited. That's probably not a good word to use, but maybe more appreciative of what it was that had taken place. I'll put out another suggestion before you, though, as we close and we open up for final comments. It might be that we're actually seeing some growth and maturity before our eyes also. You recall with the events back in chapter 11. These weren't many years back, by the way, in David's life. But when everything that took place involving Uriah, there were only two things that were on the king's mind. Number one, preservation of his own life. Number two, preservation of his position of power. And number three, in what appears to be a period of about 1 year after he commits adultery and he lies about it multiple times, he murders. We don't have any indication that he ever shed a tear about any of those sins that he committed, to hang on to his own life and his own power. Yet, this time, when someone has died, now granted it's the son of the king, okay, and that's a little bit different, but at the same time, in this occasion, when someone has died, David still has his own life, he still has his position of power, but we find the king weeping, wishing that he could give up his power, wishing that he could give up his own life so that another could live. I think it might be a case that the king is growing in his relationship with God. All right, as we bring things together here, any other final observations, comments, or any questions you might have through the text that we've gone through in chapter 18, the death of the king's son? Okay. So if you will, for next time, let's read chapter 19. It's a pretty lengthy one. I think we can get through that, though. Let's read chapter 19, and I would ask you, if you'd be so generous with your time, let's try to commit to memory verse 30. 2 Samuel 19:30. We're going to try to unite the kingdom back together, and that'll be next Wednesday evening.